Now.
Thank you.
Can you see it okay?
Yep.
Looks good.
Good. Make sure everything's working. Yep, perfect.
Okay, Victoria, we're streaming live, so you're ready to go at 7 o'clock.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this virtual public information center for the City of Brantford's new zoning bylaw project. My name is Victoria Coates, and I'm a senior planner at the city. And thank you all for joining us on this very snowy day. We were able to move this meeting to virtual only meeting, so hopefully everyone is still able to attend. And this meeting is being recorded and streamed on YouTube. So you will be able to watch back the recording at a later date. We're very happy to be back in front of the public and stakeholders as we continue to move forward with the new zoning bylaw project. This project is focused on establishing a new zoning bylaw for the city of Brantford that will replace the city's existing bylaw, as well as the county of Brant's bylaw that currently applies to the boundary adjustment lands that were annexed to the city. The new zoning bylaw is going to implement the city's new official plan, address provincial policies and emerging best practices. And today we are going to have a presentation on the strategic directions report. So Paul Lowe's of SGL Planning and Design will be giving that presentation today. And after the presentation, we will have an opportunity for questions. And Paul, as well as another member of our consulting team, Ron Palmer, is in attendance to answer questions, as well as a number of staff. So you'll be able to ask questions and make any comments. And then I also just wanted to acknowledge that we do have several counselors with us tonight. So Councillor Samwell, Councillor Carpenter, Councillor Caputo, Councillor Martin, and Councillor Sless are all joining us here as well. Oh, and I see Councillor Sullivan and Councillor Hunt as well. So, and Councillor Secolia, full house tonight. So that's great to see. And I think, we'll just, I'm going to turn it over to Paul to get us started with the presentation right away. So Paul.
Thanks, Victoria. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I started off with what is a zoning bylaw? Many of you probably know that and deal with it on a regular basis, but others may not. So a zoning bylaw is intended to, municipality has an official plan, and the city of Brantford has a very recent official plan that Ron and myself worked on along with Victoria, and prepared that official plan, and council approved it a couple of years ago. So what a zoning bylaw does is implements that official plan and provides more detail, on the uses that are permitted on a property, and provides more detail on what can go on that property in terms of the uses in a building and where can that building be located on the property. So how tall that building is, how big the building is, the size of the front yards and the rear yards, the size of side yards, the amount of parking that's required for that building on the property, landscaping requirements, and other requirements that we'll go through. So that's what a zoning bylaw is. Really drills down on a property level and identifies what can occur on that property. And a zoning bylaw can be quite technical document. We're going to try and create a document that is much more easy to read for the public. So I just want to go through where we're at in the project. We've had a number of phases so far, and as Victoria said, we're at the strategic direction phase, and that report has been produced. Previous phase, we had a series of background discussion papers that looked at every topic, every different zone, general provisions, parking, definitions, and looked at how the existing zoning bylaw and the Brant County bylaw that applies within the city, how they can be revised and updated to be more current, to conform to the official plan, and make sure that current trends and development are addressed properly in that zoning bylaw. So those discussion papers were summarized in an overall summary paper, and in many cases it said, the summary paper said we could do this option or we could do that option. What the strategic directions paper does is take it one step farther. It takes it from those discussion papers and basically sets out the format for the new zoning bylaw. So in the strategic directions paper, every chapter will be the chapter in the zoning bylaw, and it sets out what our recommendations are overall for how that chapter should be structured. And so that's what we're going to go through tonight. After this PIC, we're moving into phase 5, which is actually writing the zoning bylaw. And we've actually already started on different chapters of the zoning bylaw. Once we finish that draft, we'll be again out to the public, out to your folks, to go over that draft of the zoning bylaw, get your input at a high level, and whatever input you have, and we'll then make revisions and provide a final comprehensive zoning bylaw to the city. And we'll go through a more formal review process at that time with a statutory public meeting before council. So that's where we're at in the process. And so I'm just going to go through each of the sections of the strategic directions report. So this sets out the various chapters of the strategic report. We start with 2 because chapter 1's introduction, but this will be chapter 2 of the strategic directions report will be the first chapter in the new zoning bylaw, and each of these will be separate chapters or sections in the new zoning bylaw. So this allows us to walk you through just what the zoning bylaw will look like. We start off. What we're going to start off with is a user guide section, and this is set out in that strategic direction report. And what a user guide is, and you don't have it in your current zoning bylaw or in the Brant County zoning bylaw, but in some of the newer zoning bylaws we've worked on, we put in this user guide section. It really is intended to help the public understand how to use the bylaw. You want to know what your property is zoned, what you can do on your property, what the setbacks are on your property. This document will easily walk you through that document. We walk you through that process. And an easy way to find out what's happening. We're going to have maps. We're going to have different symbols to help you out. And it will be a step-by-step guide. We'll also have a little section on what's the purpose of the zoning bylaw, how that works with the official plan, how that intends so that the public can understand how the two work together, and then have a step-by-step guide. We got a comment earlier today about how about also adding to the guide, what if you want to submit an application, what's the process for submitting a zoning application? So I think we're going to add that as well. It was a good suggestion that would add to this user guide. The next section, the really interesting section, is the administrative section. we find this in the beginning of all bylaws. It's really just how the bylaw is to be implemented and how it's to be interpreted. Many of these provisions are already in the city's current zoning bylaw. We're going to carry forward those. We see a number of them: application, interpretation, inspections, penalties, validity. All of those matters are going to be carried forward. There's a few others we've identified in our review of Brant counties and review of other did best practice of a number of newer zoning bylaws of similar sized municipalities. And there's a number of other sections we're going to add to this administration section to help in that interpretation and help understand the bylaw. General provisions. So general provisions, what they are, you find this in every zoning bylaw. And these are standards that apply to generally all properties in across the municipality. So they're general and that they apply across the municipality. Sometimes they're more topic focused, such as we'll have general provisions on bed and breakfasts, on home occupations, but those apply across a number of different zones. Many of the general provisions from Brant County we're going to carry forward. In the background discussion papers, each of them were reviewed. They were compared in Brant County versus Brantford. Then we looked at other best practices to see what other ones were missing and we should apply. And a full list is set out in the strategic directions report. And what we've done in the strategic direction report is provided a little summary so when you read it, you can understand just a snippet of what that general provision is about. So this is a table, a very long table, but this just sets out generally how we've described it in the strategic directions. So we have what the provision is, and then just a summary of what that provision will be addressing, just so you can follow along on that. I'm not going to go through each one of them. It's a long list. Take our full hour to explain each one of them, but it's there for your consideration and review. As you see, we have things like a bed and breakfast, and this is just the start of the table. We're just in the A's and B's. The general provisions are one of the most lengthy section in a zoning bylaw because there's a lot of different aspects there to cover off. The next section in the bylaw will be the definition section. And again, we reviewed the definitions, all the definitions in the Brantford zoning bylaw and the Brant County zoning bylaw. We compared those definitions and we looked at, again, other definitions from other municipalities' bylaws. And we created a list that are recommended. Some of them are not to be carried forward. Some of them will be carried forward. And we just had a different highlights for each section. They're all listed in the strategic directions report, but the previous report, background discussion paper, this is a snippet from the background discussion paper. It went through each of these definitions, provided comment, and provided recommendation on how we're going to deal with it. Some cases we're deleting definitions because we don't think we need it. For instance, in some of the older zoning bylaws, and we find a little bit of that in Brantford zoning bylaw, a lot of different types of retail are defined. Well, whether it's a jewelry store or a clothing store or a bookstore, it's retail. And basically, we're going to permit retail in certain zones, and they'll cover all types of retail. So we don't need to define each of those uses. So you see some of those. That's just one example. Some of the definitions we're carrying forward right now, but once we get into writing the zoning bylaw, some we may not need them when we look at all the permitted uses. So they're kind of to be determined, and others you'll see green. It's not on this excerpt from the list, but the green ones are the ones we're carrying forward. The next section in the bylaw will be the parking and loading standards, and we pulled this out from the general provisions where you find it today in your zoning bylaw. We pulled it out into a separate section. We think that's important. We've updated. We have a lengthy table. First of all, we started with a lengthy review of all the parking standards and compared again to other municipalities' zoning bylaws, more recent zoning bylaws. We looked at the standards that are in the municipality, and we determined where some should be updated. Many are maintained. We also looked at trying to simplify it. So uses that are a similar type of use, can we use the same parking standard? We see that in a lot of the commercial and industrial uses. There's also, in some of the older zoning bylaws, and Brantford was an example, the parking requirements for community facilities, places of assembly, those that are large large spaces, rather than the bylaws would often say it's based on the capacity of the building or the capacity of the space or the number of seats in the building or the number of pews in the place of worship. Well, those way to define the amount of parking is very hard for the zoning folks to interpret and implement. So most of these we've gone with a gross floor area, so the size of the space itself, and so it's the amount of spaces required per square foot of space. And this is the best way to try and implement it and make sure that the space is providing the correct amount of parking. We've also, coming out of our background discussion papers, there was a direction from the task force, the zoning bylaw task force, to look at in a little more depth the apartment and block townhouse parking requirements by doing a study of existing apartments in Brantford. So the city staff did a parking utilization study and looked at case studies of 11 different apartment buildings and 3 block townhouse developments. And what they did is they counted how many of the parking spaces were occupied and compared that to the amount of apartment units on the site. And they did that over a number of different days, and they did it over a number of different times, including, I found out earlier today, the middle of the night between 12 and 4 a.m. And they found those were often the most occupied times, but they did it in many different times to find out what was the peak period and the peak amount of parking required. They also did a survey of property managers from a number of different apartment buildings and block townhouse developments. And they found that the average parking utilization rates are lower than the city's current zoning bylaw requirements. They found the lowest rates were both in the downtown and more so in those that were affordable housing projects, so affordable housing apartments and townhouse developments. And they came up with a recommendation, which you find, and I believe it's table 7 of a report in the parking section. This is an excerpt. This is the table from that recommends it. So right now, the apartment requirements, I remember, is 1.5 spaces per unit, and the recommendation is having a space per unit plus a visitor space per unit. So for affordable housing projects would be 0.5 spaces per unit plus 1.15 per visitor. So basically 0.65 spaces per unit. For a typical apartment building, at 1 space per unit plus 0.15 for visitors. Block townhouses, the visitor requirement they found this would be slightly higher at 0.25, same with stacked townhouses. Mixed use building would be the same as an apartment, but the commercial component of a mixed use building would be whatever the commercial rate is in the zoning bylaw. So if it's a retail or an office, or if it's a personal service, whatever the rate is would be in addition for that floor area that's occupied by the commercial use. For apartments in the downtown urban growth center, they found that 0.7 spaces per unit would be appropriate, plus 0.15 for visitors. So that's 0.85. Now, the question was asked earlier today in one of our meetings was, well, what happens if you have 4 units and the visitor rate's 0.15? What do you do? It's obviously less than a unit. Well, the parking requirement is that you always round up. So if, for instance, you do your calculations and you need 20.1 spaces, well, that means you need 21 spaces. So it's always rounded up in terms of the amount of parking spaces. There's a number of other parking provisions. Many of these are from your existing zoning bylaw. There's a number of others we're looking at for commercial spaces, and for apartments, we'd be looking at bicycle parking requirements. That's typical for municipalities of your current size. Also looking at electrical vehicle charging requirements. Looking at compact parking spaces. So you'll often see in commercial and apartment buildings where you might have a certain percentage or little smaller spaces for compact cars, and we'd allow a certain maximum percentage for that. We also updating the loading space requirement. So for larger commercial buildings and for apartment buildings, there's going to be a loading space requirement. Also for drive-throughs, we have a stacking rate, and I think there's a little spelling error in this table. It says staking rate, and we're not going to stake them. We're going to stack them. What that means is when you come up to a drive-through and there's a series of cars in line, there's a certain amount that the bylaw is going to require that's provided for instance, for Tim Hortons, there's going to be a certain amount of parking stacking spaces required for Tim Hortons has to provide through their site plan to ensure that there's enough room for everybody to get into the drive-through. There's going to be ones that will be required up to the order window, and then certain amount of spaces between the order window and the delivery window. Next, we get into the next chapters. We get into the actual zones. First is the mixed use zones, and in the background papers in the summary paper, you have seen that there was a recommendation to restructure the zoning bylaw to reflect the designations in the official plan. This really allows the public to understand a little bit more carefully how the official plan and the zoning bylaw work, and it's a little easier to understand if you have for instance, the historic Main Street designation. We'll have a historic Main Street zone. So the zone categories and the designations equally match. So it's a lot more easier to follow for the public. So we'll have 6 different mixed use zones, 3 of them in the downtown, and these reflect the designations. So we have the historic Main Street zone in the downtown. We have lower downtown, we have upper downtown, major commercial center, the malls, larger plazas, which are currently designated major commercial. And then we have the intensification corridors. We have 2 different intensification corridors here because the Brant Heritage Conservation District, Brant Street, has separate provisions because it's a Heritage Conservation District plan that applies to it, which provides specific requirements to try and maintain that heritage character. So it will have different zone provisions from the rest of the intensification corridors that are identified in the official plan. We also have the typical lot zoning provisions, plus a few others that I'm going to get into, including amenity space, ground floor height, and balcony height, balcony depth, and others that are going to provide transitions for taller buildings, which I'll get into. For all of our zones, we're creating these tables that you see here. This is the mixed use zone table, so make it easier to understand. Well, let's see, we have the zones on the top and along the side, and this is just an excerpt, so we don't have all the uses, but along the left-hand column are the permitted uses, and with the zones along the top. And so you can see, going down historic Main Street, you can see all the yeses. Those are all the uses are permitted. And there's many more. This is just an excerpt of the table. And you can see that for each of the zones. And we'll do that for each of the different zone categories. In terms of looking at the height for the various zones, we're recommending minimum and maximum heights for each zone, subject to transition and angular plane requirements. So where these mixed-use zones are located close to a low-density residential area, we're going to require a transition in height and density. So even though there's a maximum height, a developer may not be able to achieve that maximum height because they have to meet these performance standards. An angular plane is usually an angle coming from the low-density residential up. It's usually a 45-degree angular plane. So you go from the property line of the low-density residential up at a 45-degree angle, which means that the apartment building, the mixed-use building, either has to be stepped back or staggered back. So it's not overlooking and reflecting shadow on the low-density residential area. So for the zones, we're looking at the historic Main Street zone, the core of the downtown. A height of maximum height of 6 stories, although we've got some comments on whether that's a little too short. So we're re-looking at that and seeing what's the appropriate height for the historic Main Street. The lower downtown zone, which reflects lower downtown designation, would be a height of 24 stories. So this is the area around the casino and down to the river. Upper Main Street zone, up all the way to the train station, a maximum height of 6 stories. Again, we've got comments whether, particularly around the train station, whether that is appropriate height or should it be higher. So we'll be looking at that. Welcome any thoughts people have on those. The major commercial zone would be a maximum height of 18 stories. So again, these are the mall and the large plaza sites. The Brant Avenue Heritage Conservation District, it's limited in terms of height through the Heritage Conservation District plan to 3 stories. So we'll be reflecting that in the zoning bylaw. And then on the intensification corridors, we have 2 different areas. In the official plan, Erie Avenue is to be limited to 6 stories, whereas the rest of the corridors, we're looking at a maximum of 12 stories. And in certain areas along the intensification corridors where there's existing commercial main streets, we'll be requiring the ground floor commercial uses will be required in those areas to try and maintain that main street commercial character. And I indicated there's some different provisions we'll be applying for taller buildings. This will apply both to the mixed use buildings and to the high density residential, which I'll get into. But we'll be looking at things like a podium height. And what a podium is when you have a building taller than a mid-rise, basically generally taller than 6 stories, will require a podium. So a lower part of the building, a low part, up to 3 stories generally. And then the tower part, the part above 3 stories, will be set back and smaller in size. And I'm going to show you some examples of that. Then we'll look at provisions for setbacks of the tower from the podium, separation of towers. So there's spaces so you don't have people putting their hands out the balcony and shaking with somebody else. You get a nice separation for privacy. Maximum size of the floor plate of a tower in order to reduce the shadowing effect. And then I talked about angular planes. And then many of these provisions are already set out in the city's urban design manual, and we'll be reflecting those in the zoning bylaw to provide more strength. So just an example, the building on the left is more of a mid-rise building, but it still has, you'll see this, a base, the podium, a little bit setback, and the middle. The one on the right is an example of towers. And you see there the podium. This is a little taller podium. We will be requiring a lower podium in Brantford, but you can see that there's a podium, and then the tower is smaller than the podium, and there's also a separation between the 2 towers. So we'll be looking at all these different provisions and what is appropriate for Brantford. Frankly, these towers are a bit too wide, too large. We'd probably be looking at a 750 square meter floor plate, which is kind of a standard for a smaller tower, and it has less bulk to it. An example of an angular plane that I talked about, this is an example where you have an angular plane required, and this is just an example of a 13-story tower on top of a 3-story podium, just for an example. But you can see how then you'd step that back away from the low density residential. So our next zones are the residential zones, and we have 6 residential zones reflecting the different designation in the official plan. So we start with the lowest density is the suburban residential zone, and this does not mean all suburbs. What this means is the areas, basically Tudor Heights, which is unserviced. No municipal services, and all the properties are on septic. So these are large lot, single detached homes because they're on septics. Then the rest of the existing neighborhood would be existing neighborhood low rise zone, which will apply to most of the residential areas in the city. Excuse me. Then the next is a greenfield neighborhood low rise zone, and what this is your newer greenfield areas. So this is newer areas that are serviced around Tudor Heights. Shellard would be some of those newer greenfield areas are just being finished, and the boundary adjustment lands, generally north of Powerline Road. Those will all be in the greenfield low rise, and you'll see that permits a bit broader range of housing. Then we have the neighborhood corridor zone. A neighborhood corridor was identified in the official plan. There's an area around Tootle Heights. There's an area north of Port Power Line Road, which has a higher density along a corridor. Also permits a little bit of range of commercial uses. And then we have a mid-rise residential mid-rise zone and a residential high-rise zone. The mid-rise zone is very similar to your medium density that are already in the city zoning bylaw. So all those medium density zones will be captured in the mid-rise zone. So the suburban zone, as I said, is the unserviced on private septics, minimum lot area of 4,000 square meters, or basically 1 acre, which is what's required for a septic. Lot frontage of 24 meters. So these are the large lot singles. Then the existing neighborhood will permit singles, semi-detached, duplex and triplex, which all basically fall under the province's new requirements, where you can have up to 3 units in a single attached and semi-detached dwelling. Maximum of 3 stories. The Greenfield neighborhood low-rise zone will permit a little bit broader range of uses, permitting street townhouses, again in with a 3-story height limit. The neighborhood corridor zone would allow both the low-rise and mid-rise buildings up to 6 stories, except near Tootle Heights, so it would be only 4 stories in height. Then we have the mid-rise zone, which would be the medium density sites, and those would be for new zones would be 6 stories, but in your existing zoning bylaw, there's a number of them that are that have a maximum height of 4 stories, and would keep that for all the existing, basically all the existing medium density zones would keep that at 4 stories. And then our high-rise zone will permit a maximum of 12 stories. And we'll also permit on the ground floor neighborhood supporting uses. And those would be restaurants, retail, convenience retail, personal services. So I forgot to indicate that's also permitted in the neighborhood corridor zone. So that completes the residential zones. Then we have an institutional zone. And we'll have 2 institutional zones, a minor institutional zone. So these are like elementary schools, places of worship, daycares, and a major institutional zone, the hospital, high schools, the university will be all major institutional. And because of these institutional uses are very different in terms of the land area requirements and the type of buildings, we'll have different provisions in terms of lot and yard provision. So size of a lot, coverage, the height will be different for each one of these different types of institutional uses. Employment zones will have 2 employment zones, again, reflecting the designations of the official plan. The official plan has a general employment designation and a prestige employment designation. So we'll reflect those in 2 different zones. And we'll have basically all the typical lot and yard provisions that you find in your current zoning bylaw, except we're going to eliminate maximum lot coverage for industrial uses. We'd like to maximize the amount of industrial space you can get on a property. And it'll be limited to landscape strip requirements and basically parking, loading requirements. And that's really driven by the type of industry. They'll set what they need in terms of parking and loading. We'll have some provisions, but they often have their own requirements. And we'll also be implementing the city's urban design manual that has provisions for employment uses. Next, we get in the commercial zones. You recall I said the major commercial, those really large sites are going to be mixed use. But we have in the neighborhoods, we have smaller commercial uses. So we'll have an automobile gas station zone, which you'll find in the neighborhoods. You also find them along the intensification corridors, but we'll have those in a separate zone provision because they're different requirements when you have a gas station, service station. Then we'll have a convenience commercial zone, and that's really the really small little convenience commercial shops, stores, often find it's just one building, one store that you find in the interior of a residential neighborhood. Then a little bit bigger, we have a neighborhood commercial zone, which is typically your smaller commercial plazas you find in the neighborhood, often anchored by a grocery store, maybe a drugstore. And we'll have different provisions for it. And we'll also allow it to have up to 4 stories if it wants to go a mixed use. So 3 stories of residential above the commercial. But we'll have different provisions if it's just standalone commercial versus a mixed use building. Then we have agricultural zones. Or currently, the Brantford doesn't have an agricultural zone, but now that the city's boundary adjustment lands have incorporated some agricultural areas that were not brought into the city's urban boundary, but still part of the municipal boundary, those lands will continue to be zoned as agriculture. Currently, the county has 2 different agricultural zones, but for the size of the area we're talking about, we felt that 1 agricultural zone was sufficient. But we'll have different provisions for whether it's a farm or a rural residential lot or a greenhouse or a farm production property. We'll also have to implement the minimum distance separation requirements. And what minimum distance separation requirements are is a guideline from the province that sets out the minimum distance you need to be separated from a livestock facility, or alternatively, a livestock facility needs to be separated from existing residential. So we'll be reflecting that in the zoning bylaw. And then we'll have a core natural zone, and this reflects basically the natural environmental areas that are designated in your official plan, core natural area designation in your official plan, and it will be zoned accordingly. And this zone will be a bit different from all the other zones in terms of most of the other zones. The zone boundary will be based on the lot fabric, so based on the lot boundary, whereas core natural areas don't reflect property boundaries, and you'll have half of a property might be, or a quarter of a property might be in a natural zone, another will be developable for residential commercial purposes. So it won't follow property boundaries, and it will split a property, but that's required to ensure we protect those natural features. We'll have permitted uses in the zone, but we won't generally have lot provisions, yard provisions, because most of it we naturalize. There's a few cases where we'll have buildings, but in most cases there won't be buildings in the core natural zone. And then we have an open space zone. So this is where your parks and open space. It's also golf course, cemetery are zoned open space. So we'll have different provisions for cemeteries and golf courses versus parks. In most cases, it's going to be open space, but there's going to be some recreation facilities. So we have different lot and yard requirements for some of those provisions. And our last zone is the development zone. And I think I'm saying, Paul, why do we have a development zone? It's most of the area is developed. What this is for the boundary adjustment lands, because we don't know at this point where the Greenfield neighborhood residential is going to go versus school sites versus parks that will be designated as zoned open space. Schools will be designated as zoned institutional. We have the neighborhood corridor. We don't know exactly where it's going to go. We'll know that once the block plans are done that the landowners have to prepare, and then they'll prepare their draft plans of subdivision to provide a detail where all the lots go, and then they'll bring forward a zoning bylaw. And at that time, we'll be able to implement the zoning, all these different zones for that area. But in the meantime, we'll zone it development D, which is basically an interim zone until that more detailed work is done over the coming years. So it really is an interim measure for those lands. So that finishes a review of the zoning bylaw. Hope that was all understandable. Lots more detail in the strategic directions report, as I said. Welcome any feedback you have tonight or later. If you have comments you want to come to mind, I want you to take a more detailed look at the strategic directions report, and you have other comments or questions, we're certainly open to any of those as we continue to work through the next step. As I said, the next step is the first draft of the comprehensive zoning bylaw. And over the next couple of months, if just a thought comes to mind, or you think, this zone should permit this use, we're welcome to any comments you have as we work through the zoning bylaw. And this is just our first cut of the permitted uses and general provisions. As we work through the zoning bylaw, there may be some changes, particularly changes we hear from the public. And the next step is a COW presentation on March 21st, the Committee of the Whole on March 21st, and then we get into writing the document. So that's the fun of my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing now, Victoria, and turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Paul. I think we can do have a couple of questions in the chat we could start with. And then I can maybe turn it over to Darlene to keep letting people raise their hand to ask some questions. But the first question we have here is from James Warren. It says, regarding definitions, will amenity space be further defined to delineate private amenity versus common amenity? For example, common element condominium developments may only need a certain amount of private amenity, since townhouses may have their own private rear yard / private amenity area, whereas an apartment would require common amenity since balconies are only 4 meters squared per unit.
Yeah, that's a very good question. We will have a definition of amenity space, and then we'll indicate what counts for amenity space, both indoor and outdoor amenity space. And then in each of the zones, it will identify, for instance, the apartments, how much amenity space is required. And we'll probably leave it up to the development. We'll probably say this amount of amenity space is required. It could be indoor or an outdoor, provided you meet that minimum amount of amenity space. But we will definitely be defining that and clarifying all of that.
And then the second question we have in the chat says, for a maximum of 3 stories, we find 11.5 meters as a maximum equivalent results in fewer minor variance applications being required. This is more of a comment than a question there.
Okay, Victoria. At this time, we do have 10 attendees joining our meeting this evening. Just a reminder to everyone to use your raised hand feature. If anyone has any questions, we will give everybody a chance to comment or ask their questions. But at this time, I'll give the opportunity to Mayor Davis and the council if they have a comment or a question. I see that Councillor Slust already has his hand up. Councillor Slust, if you'd like to go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Arlene. I've got a couple. It always concerns me when we legislate that ground floor commercial has to be part of a multi-story building in certain areas. But I guess history shows us that they're quite often empty and they become unsightly. Is there a better way to determine the need? And well, that's not our job to determine the need, whether commercial is warranted, but we dictate in a lot of cases that it is warranted or that it has to be installed, even though in all likelihood it's going to remain empty or partially empty and be unsightly to the building.
Yeah, very good question. So although we've got these mixed use zones, in some of the cases, particularly on intensification corridors, it's permissive. You could create a mixed use building, or you could create an apartment building, or you could create just commercial. So there's that flexibility. But there are specific locations where you're going to want to maintain a main street, because the worst thing that will kill a main street is if you insert a non-residential, a residential use that's non-resident, that doesn't maintain that retail commercial character in the center of that main street. So we'll be identifying what we're going to call priority commercial areas, and those are the priority areas are where you're going to require ground floor commercial, and it'll be those existing main street areas. Other areas, other mixed use areas, no, it's flexible. Provide what the market dictates, what the landowner wants to provide.
Okay, thank you. And one further, do we have the ability to legislate at the development of an elementary or a secondary school drop-off zones off-road?
It's more, maybe Ron wants to jump in on this as well. It's more of a site plan matter. Normally, you deal with that through site plan than through zoning. Ron, you have any examples on that?
Yeah, in new builds, in a greenfield situation, it's certainly achievable to get on-site drop-off facilities incorporated into the site plan. That would require, I think, a conversation with the school boards to ensure that they have enough space to do that. It gets a little trickier within the existing settlement area where you just simply don't have the space. Most of the time, though, those schools already exist and the problem already exists. So trying to find solutions to that through a retrofit is very difficult. But absolutely, in the greenfield area, in the new urban area, I think that that's a really good element, since more and more students are bused or dropped off by their parents. So absolutely, it's a big traffic generator at those very specific times of day, and it can become quite a problem for the rest of the neighborhood.
Right. No, I appreciate that. I'm not looking at trying to force something on something that's existing, but as we move forward and new schools are being built, I think we should be mindful of the mess around every existing school in the city, because it becomes a little unruly, like you say, at certain times of the day. But I appreciate that, and thanks for the answer. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, Victoria, it looks like we do have a few more questions in our Q&A section.
Okay, yeah, I'll read some of them out. So from Douglas Stewart, is the garage considered as part of the parking requirements for residential units like townhouses?
Yes.
And the next question, what's your thinking regarding accessory use for buildings? For example, daycare facilities inside of office buildings.
Yeah, that would definitely be a use. So we probably just have that as a permitted use in that zone, but something we could definitely look at. I would think we'd make it permitted as a right rather than just accessory.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question is the angular plane measured from the interface of the designation, low rise versus mid rise, or if the existing land use is low rise?
It'd be measured from the property line of the low-rise residential use.
I think that question is referring to use as opposed to if it's zoned for a use. I'm guessing.
I see. Yes, yeah. No, I understand now. Yeah, so if it's in for instance, in an intensification corridor, it's intended that area in the over the life of the zone would be redeveloped in the intensification corridor, so it'd be to the low-rise residential zone itself, the property boundary of a house in the low-rise residential zone.
And then the next question is, what's the general intent for the municipality to have more mixed-use areas or more to segregate, for example, employment areas from commercial and institutional?
Well, that's all comes out of the official plan. Ron, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent question. And the move is toward a more mixed-use municipality, particularly where the mixture of uses are retail, service, commercial, and residential. Institutional is typically embedded within the community as well. The only use that tends to remain somewhat segregated is the industrial users. And that's because they tend to have measurable impact that needs to be mitigated, probably through distance. So throughout Brantford, if you look back into the official plan, it is an array of residential and mixed use designations, with the employment areas somewhat segregated, attached to the community, but segregated in terms of land uses. They can also become mixed use with the introduction of some retail and service, commercial and institutional development, but generally that's a little more highly regulated. The move is, though, for a more mixed use municipality for a whole host of positive reasons. And at the end of the day, an easier place to walk around, to cycle around, to achieve your daily needs without having to hop in your car, maybe even working, going to school, shopping, and living, all within a 15-minute radius.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions by using your raised hand feature? Okay, we have an attendee. Douglas Stewart would like to ask a question.
Thank you, and I appreciate what you presented here today. I guess I have two questions. If the official plan identifies a property today as some form of commercial, but the existing bylaw, the approved bylaw, identifies it as a residential, is the intent of this proposed bylaw to identify it for commercial?
Yeah, most cases it's going to be mixed use, Douglas. Most of the commercial, because the commercial zones are just those minor commercial and neighborhood and convenience. Those are probably just reflect existing ones. So it will be probably you're thinking along an intensification corridor where there's
Correct.
yeah. So those areas, yeah, the intent is to basically pre-zone those areas for the intent for what the official plan intends. So for the mixed use permissions.
And
That's
I
great.
think just to add to that, Mr. Stewart,
Ooh, so formal.
yeah, the point that Paul made before about permission for retail with residential versus requirement for retail in a mixed use zone is a really important one. And that's going to be a pretty close analysis that has to be done through the mapping exercise to determine where it's a permission along with residential and where it's a requirement at grade with residential.
Right. In this instance, it's a piece of property that splits. The OP applies across the whole property, but the current bylaw splits it between commercial at the front and residential at the back. So that's great. I appreciate it. My second question is a little more involved. When you apply the bylaw, let's say it's an area to be zoned as residential, it's clear there'll be standards that have to apply. What will occur on an existing situation, an existing lot of record where the permission would be fine, it permits residential and all that would include, but say the frontage isn't sufficient, but yet you could propose residential. The question is, will it do the specific frontage, or will it be that it's it'll be considered legal non-conforming? I hope I explained it. If I didn't, I apologize.
No, I think I understand, Douglas. Yeah, what we'll be doing is we'll be zoning, providing the new lot frontage. In most cases, it'll be allowing for some infill, so it's not going to be restrictive. There might be certain areas where we might want to do an overlay that requires a little larger lots, but in most cases it won't be. Although there's always, because we're applying a new zone, there may be some properties that become legal non-conforming, especially in the older areas. But we'll be looking at ones that will allow for some infill. So hope that answers your question.
It does. So in the next stage 5, will we see the actual bylaw?
Yeah. Yes.
Great.
Yep.
That's great.
Draft bylaw. Next step is a draft bylaw.
That is great to hear.
Okay, Councillor Carpenter, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Douglas, for the segue. It's perfect. That would be my question. Would be the older industrial areas that we are in residential areas that we want to eliminate them. Are they just grandfathered out so they're legal non-conforming and they're allowed for residential intensification?
For those that are now converted and designated to residential? Yes, that would be the case.
But the
Where
ones,
intent-
yes, the ones where they're industrial, for example, where we used to have industrial areas, mixed in with residential areas, and we're trying to move them out of residential areas. In the zoning bylaw, I think we've changed them, have we not? So is that still the case going forward? Will they just be in existence and be non-conforming, but they're also available to be redeveloped into residential?
Paul,
It depends.
I
Yeah, I was just going to add, Ron. Then I'll turn it over to you.
Okay.
It depends on the official plan, because the official plan, and Ron can speak to this, maintain some of the older industrial areas designated as industrial, and then made recommendations for converting others. So Ron, go ahead on that.
Yeah, what happened through the official plan process is that we did identify a number
Yes.
of those historic industrial areas. Some have more than one use, some have 2 or 3, but they're quite small and they're embedded within existing residential communities. We were not permitted to simply convert them through the official plan. So the way the official plan was prepared is that those areas still require a conversion, which is an official plan amendment. But the handful that were identified can be supported without going through the full conversion exercise through a municipal comprehensive review. It's simply a site-specific official plan amendment. So yes, there is process required. I don't believe we'd be permitted to pre-zone for mixed use or residential, but certainly the intent was that the owners of those areas could apply for an official plan amendment to facilitate the conversion and then apply a zone.
And why were we not allowed to include the new direction that we want to go in there?
Well, the provincial legislation, which changes every week, did not allow us to facilitate the conversion through the official plan. So that has to be done before the zoning can be applied. The zoning bylaw must conform to the official plan.
Okay, we recognize.
Just to clarify, there were a few, Ron, that we did convert from industrial to residential, and converted to commercial as well.
Did we?
Yes.
There was a handful out there.
Yeah.
Some were dealt with in one way, some were dealt with in another.
Yeah, that's why I was getting to, Paul. The ones that we did some on Gretzky, we did some on the old factories down in Rod and Keep Right Brock Street area.
Those ones you can zone.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we will be pre-zoning those for a number of those are in the intensification corridor. Some of them are major commercial, and we'll be designating for those uses.
Yeah,
okay,
zoning for those uses.
Yeah, I just hope we maintain those. Thank you.
That was a very specific opportunity because of the existing zoning being industrial commercial.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
I remember those ones too.
And then the intensification along Cobra Street where the hotels and so forth, we've done that, those ones as well as specific then. All right, thank you. I just want to make sure we're maintaining those things.
Okay, Victoria, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A section.
Okay, so we have, do you plan to publish the draft of the zoning bylaw for public access at this stage? I can answer that question. So we are currently working on the draft of that zoning bylaw. Once it is prepared, it will be posted for public access. We'll be having additional opportunities for consultation on that. There'll be another public information center, and we'll be welcoming feedback on that first draft. And the next question is, how can we get a link for the record of the session or when it will be published on YouTube? So yeah, it will be published on YouTube. And I think after the meeting, I don't know if Stephen could comment on how long that takes, but you can certainly send me an email if you need help finding that, and I can send you the direct link to it. And our next question is, have you created a draft land use map where the new zones will be outlined, or will that be part of the next step? Yeah, I can answer that question as well. So that will be part of the next step. We'll be actually, doing a map and showing where the different zones will apply. And just, I see one more question here, a copy of the presentation. We can also circulate a copy of the presentation as well. So yeah, if you just want to send me an email and I can make sure to get that to you.
Okay, Councillor Carpenter, you have another question? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a question that constituents are emailing me that are watching on YouTube, so I'm just getting through that way. Yeah, the question is kind of general. It says, what's happening in the R1 area? So we made a, could you sort of generalize what we've done in the R1s for the constituent that's asked on my, to me directly from email.
So the R1 would be the existing low-rise residential. So basically maintaining the permitted uses in that zone. We're going to be taking a lot of the lower density R zones and collapsing them together. There may be some specific areas where we have different different lot requirements. We don't know. We're thinking could do it as an overlay zone where, say, this area will have larger lots or smaller lots, but generally it's going to be all into one zone, maintaining the same permissions in terms of uses.
Yes.
The one exception is the additional residential units, which will need to be incorporated as well.
Yeah, it's just for the public. What that means is the province is now mandated that all municipalities in an urban area on service lots must allow up to 3 units per property for in a single semi-detached or townhouse development.
And that'll be through all through the R1s.
Yeah, all through the R1s.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I don't see any show of hands raised. Does anyone have any further follow-up questions or any questions or comments at all?
Just one, if I may. First of all, how long before we actually finish this process? And I think, are we first in the process in the province? We seem to be ahead of everybody. Am I reading that right?
Victoria, you want to respond?
I don't know if are we first? I don't know. I think
you were the first. You were the first to get a first single or upper tier to get their official plan approved by the province. Yes.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
So we're ahead of the single and upper tiers in terms of doing their zoning bylaw. There's a number of lower tiers are updating their zoning bylaw right now, but in terms of conformity with the province, yeah, you're out ahead.
Okay, I just want to thank staff for all the hard work on this.
All right, just make sure that there are any other questions before we end. Okay, hi. Oh, something just pop up here. Okay, there's another question here in the chat. How do you reflect Bill 23?
That's easy, Paul. Yes.
So the big change for at the zoning level, the Bill 23 was the change to additional dwelling units, which mandate that every property can have three units, either 3 in the dwelling or 2 in the dwelling and 1 in the accessory building. So that's going to be reflected in the zoning bylaw.
All right, I think that's all of the questions. So I just want to thank everyone for attending tonight. And if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to send me an email or any comments, and we'll be happy to answer those. We will continue working on this project. The next step, as Paul mentioned, is we will be presenting the strategic directions report to the committee of the whole on March 21st. And we are busy working away on drafting the new zoning bylaw. And again, we'll get that out for public comment as soon as possible. So with that, we'll just end the meeting. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.